Okay, so now we have to complicate things. We've spent some time in the Gospels and the writings of Paul looking at how we were once slaves to sin and now we can be free to be slaves to God, slaves to that which is good and peaceable and right, slaves to freedom, slaves to redemption. But that's not the whole story of how the New Testament and St. Paul talks about slavery and enslavement. In Galatians 3, he says, "For you are all God's sons through the faithfulness within the Anointed One Jesus. For as many of you as were baptized into the Anointed have clothed yourselves in the Anointed. There can be neither Judean nor Greek. There can be neither slave nor freeman. There cannot be male and female, for you are all one in the Anointed One, Jesus." In Christ, there is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male and female. For a Jewish person, or a Christian for that matter, in the first century, these are the central identifiers of who a person is. Are they Jewish or not? For a Jew, this would determine who they could eat with and who they couldn't, who they could marry and who they couldn't, who they could touch and who they couldn't. Are they slave or free? Are they their own? Are they a person in the fullest sense of the word? Are they in charge of their own life and destiny or not? Male and female. You get the point. Note the change in the language. Jew or Greek, slave or free, male and female. In Genesis, humanity was created male and female. It's a hearkening back to the biblical formula of creation. And that just further solidifies the point here. These basic foundational distinctions based on nationality, status, and gender are obliterated in Christ. They are no longer operational. They are no longer anything. In Galatians 3, the only distinction that matters is that one is in Christ. That's it. Being in Christ inaugurates a new reality, a new creation, as Paul says in another place. And in this new reality, this new creation, things are completely reordered, and the former categories are rendered null and void. All that is left is in Christ. Paul staked his entire ministry, his entire theological system and presentation of the gospel on the fact that it does not matter whether one is Jew or Gentile. It only matters if they are Christian. Paul absolutely insisted in Galatians in particular, but also in Acts, that Gentiles don't have to become Jewish before they become Christian. They don't have to be circumcised, even though Genesis 17 clearly says that not being circumcised means that one is cut off from God. Paul was brutally opposed by those Jewish Christians who insisted that Gentile Christians follow the whole Jewish program, including Genesis 17, in order to be a follower of Jesus in good standing. But here, he says, as plain as day, it doesn't matter. These words will be seized in the 20th century by the proponents of women's ordination to say that their gender doesn't prohibit them from being a priest, pastor, preacher, or minister, because male and female is rendered moot by being in Christ. I wonder how these words would be taken by slaves in the Galatian congregations, by the slave masters. Clearly, these words are powerful, but I think they are also not words of abolition. There is no longer Jew or Greek, but surely the Jewish Christians among them still dressed like Jews and ate like Jews, even if they embraced their brother and sister Gentiles. There is no longer male and female, but that doesn't mean that Christians for the last 2,000 years have lived androgynously without gender roles at all. So there is no longer slave or free in this context doesn't mean that slavery is no longer, but that the status of slave and or free in the Christian community wasn't supposed to matter. A Christian slave was a Christian master's brother and vice versa. But it didn't mean that the distinction didn't continue on in daily life. To make this even more complicated, in the rest of Galatians, we see a suppression of the slave and master metaphor. In Galatians 4, Paul highlights another favorite metaphor for our relationship with God. We are God's adopted children and therefore heirs of God's kingdom. In ancient adoption law, as in modern adoption law, adopted sons and daughters have the exact same legal status as natural-born children. Adopted children have just as much a claim to the inheritance of their parents as the natural-born children do. In Galatians, Paul insists that we are God's adopted children. Jesus, obviously, is God's son, but we have been adopted into God's family and are heirs of the kingdom with Jesus. Paul begins chapter 4, "But I say that, for however long a period the heir is an infant, he is no different from a slave, even though he is Lord of everything. Rather, he is subject to legal guardians and estate stewards until the term appointed by the Father. So also we, when we were infants, were enslaved in subjugation to the elementals of the cosmos. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, coming to be from a woman, coming to be under the law, so that he might redeem those under the law, in order that we should receive filial adoption. And since you are sons, God sent forth his Son's Spirit into our hearts, crying, 'Abba, Father.' Thus, you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, also an heir through God." Paul uses the exact same formula as in Romans and 1 Corinthians. But he uses different terms. In Romans and Corinthians, he said that we were first slaves to sin, and then we became slaves to God, right? But here we were slaves to the cosmos, the world. But now we are sons and daughters of God and heirs of all that God has. It's the same movement, but dramatically different verbiage. Slaves to God, or children and heirs of God. There's a big difference, right? Unlike some of the other Pauline letters, where Paul is happy to use slaves of God language, in Galatians, he pulls back on that. Galatians is an angry letter written by Paul to condemn those in the Galatian church who had decided to become circumcised. A group of preachers had come through Galatia and told these new Christians that to be real Christians, they had to be circumcised. And some of the Galatians listened to these preachers and did it. Paul wants it to be clear in this letter that Jesus means freedom. Freedom from the Jewish law and customs, and freedom from trying to earn God's love, from anything other than having faith in him. Because of this, Paul was probably reticent to use his typical slave metaphor, because that would clash with all of his talk of freedom here. Talk of being slaves of Christ and slaves to freedom would be just as theologically correct as it was in 1 Corinthians and Romans, but it would muddy the waters in this particular letter. So Paul swapped out this slave metaphor for the child of God metaphor. It complicates our journey into slavery in the New Testament, but I think it shows that there are many metaphors for our relationship with God for a reason. No one metaphor can capture the whole reality, and some metaphors are less appropriate in some places than in others.